What's going on, everyone? Austin John Plays here, and today we're going to be talking about Pokémon Scarlet and Violet's performance on the Nintendo Switch. This is a topic that I haven't really talked about in regard to this game on this system. And now, if you've played Pokémon Scarlet and Violet on the Nintendo Switch, you may be aware that it doesn't run that great. And despite the vast improvement that we've seen from version 1.0 to 1.0.1 to 1.1, there's still a lot left to be desired. I would like to take a moment and talk about the Nintendo Switch, the Tegra X1 chip inside of there, and how the Nintendo Switch doesn't utilize it to its full potential some of the time. Firstly, let's go over some basics. The Nintendo Switch came out in 2017 using pretty much just the Tegra X1 chip, which was also used in the NVIDIA Shield TV tablet. It didn't have a screen built in there, and that was released in 2015. So we're now playing a game on a processor that was made for an Android tablet 7 years ago. And yes, the V2 and the Switch Lite have the X1 Plus chip, which is just pretty much for better battery life and better power performance, but it doesn't increase the clock speeds of the system on chip in regard to the CPU, the memory, or the GPU. The official speeds of the Tegra X1 on the Nintendo Switch comes in at 1020 megahertz when it's docked. The GPU is 768 megahertz, and the memory clock is set to 1600 megahertz. But the X1 chip actually has a much higher threshold for its clock speeds. The CPU can run at 1785 megahertz and the GPU at 921. Now, the first question you would ask is, why is Nintendo purposefully underclocking their CPU to 57% of its potential and GPU down to 83% of its potential? Well, the only reason you underclock anything. The more demanding your Nintendo Switch runs, the more heat that it's going to generate, which may not be great if you're actually holding that console or in the mentality of you should be able to pick it up and play it anytime handheld. So the thermals are still a mindset, even though you're not directly holding it. The GPU does run underclocked in handheld. We're going to talk about that later. But you also get significantly better battery life, and when there's less strain on a chip, the chip lasts longer. We're talking about Nintendo, a company that's essentially making toys. And they're the people that made the Game Boy that lasted in the Gulf War that's on display at Nintendo New York. So all that being said, it makes sense why they sort of underclocked it. Now, when it comes to the handheld performance, there's actually several different profiles that are implemented for different titles that we can see greater performances in the GPU, the graphics processing unit, and the CPU still remains the same. Because of those reasons, you may be actually seeing a marginal improvement when playing Scarlet and Violet in handheld over docked mode, because the CPU is still going to be the same performance, but now it doesn't need to run as many pixels because you're locked to 720p or dynamic resolution aiming to be 720p. But there are different profiles that are used for different games, and some games including Mario Odyssey, Breath of the Wild, Mortal Kombat 11 actually use a more powerful clock speed in handheld mode that's still nowhere near the docked performance. Now, why am I telling you all this? Because there's an additional mode on the Nintendo Switch called Boost Mode. You may have heard some people talk about this a long time ago, and the difference is that Boost Mode is only used for loading screens. So you'll go from loading screen times facing 30 seconds, but when it implements this Boost Mode, you'll see it as low as 20 seconds. Now, how is that possible? Because during this Boost Mode, the CPU clock speed of the Nintendo Switch goes from its regular 1020 megahertz to the full X1 chip's potential of 1785 megahertz. Now, considering you're not constantly going to be on loading screens all of the time, and also there's very little graphics that's going to be used during this time, it's a little bit of a strain, but it's not for an extended period of time, so you're not going to see the thermals ramp up, or if you do, it's going to be quickly cooled off once the actual stage loads. Which now brings us to Pokémon Scarlet and Violet. Now, Pokémon Scarlet and Violet actually has a number of things in place to improve the performance of the game that I've observed from several people. From seeing Digital Foundry, they talk about the simple fact that there's a dynamic FPS adjustment used for how close you are to something. As opposed to we saw in Pokémon Legends Arceus, you're either close and it's at full frame rate, or you're far away and it's at slow frame rate. If we look at this windmill here, it's now performing at 30 FPS or as close as it can. Also, coincidentally, the fans on my Nintendo Switch started spinning up when I stood next to this. They're getting loud. Can you hear it? Can you hear it on the mic? Mike, can you hear it? I think he heard it. Once I move a little bit away from this windmill, it actually goes down to quarter speed. It's now displaying at about 7.5 frames per second, and if I go even further away from it, it's going to jump down to 3 frames per second, so now 1/8 of the speed. And then when you move very far away, it jumps down to 2 frames per second, and that's when it gets really, really jittery and very slow moving. When we're no longer in the town and you look at it, it's very jarring. And then, once you get closer and you're speeding, it goes from 2 to 3 to 7.5. And then, only if you're literally this close does it actually hit the full 30 FPS. Now, I was watching my friend Shiza's video on Boundary Break, and there's actually something implemented that if I were to pan my camera around, only where my camera is facing, that part of the world is loaded in, either in its low resolution or high resolution textures, but everything in the background is currently loaded. The windmill that I was just looking at is not loaded into the game. And these mountains, when I spin the camera around, they are now not loaded into the game. And I'm thinking to myself, they are doing so much to increase the performance of this game. Why does it run so poorly? Now, some notable examples of where the game actually runs really well is Area 0, because inside of Area 0, there's nothing else loaded. The entire world is not loaded when you're in Area 0, and the same thing goes for Mesa Goza. But some noticeably bad examples. I think the first one that comes to mind for everyone is the Tag Tree Thicket. Once you start going in here, first of all, we just had a big pause, and even as we're going, the game is running so poorly. Even when I zoom into the camera, we are definitely not hitting 30 FPS. How late those Pokemon spawned in, I'm gonna stop boosting now, and I'm just gonna drive at normal speed, and you're still gonna notice that the game is trying so hard to keep up, but even as I'm rotating the camera, you're seeing so much slowdown and so many issues. Casaroya Lake, anytime that you make your way inside of that water, the game does not run well at all. You get stutter, you get slowdown to the point that it's actually hard for you to keep going around because the Pokemon are loading in so late that sometimes you'll just drive into them. Granted, this is significantly better than this lake was on version 1.0 or even 1.0.1, but still, it's not operating great. So we know that the X1 chip inside of the Nintendo Switch can run at faster speeds, and we know that there are times that Nintendo Switch actually utilizes those faster speeds. This now raises the question of, what if we were to implement those boost mode speeds all the time? So I'm not going to be talking about how to overclock your Nintendo Switch or any information like that, as that would definitely void your warranty. You have to have a homebrew Switch active, and in addition, there are many risks to overclocking a system or a Nintendo Switch, so I'm just going to not be covering that information here and just talking about this for demonstration purposes only. As you've been noticing for the last little bit here, this game is running very, very smoothly. As I transition from one area to another, we have seamless gameplay. Now, the windmill is still going to be performing at that same 2 to 3 to 7.5 frames per second because that's how it's programmed to run. And then once we get close, we see the full 30 FPS. Well, okay, that was just the field. What about those really stressful areas, like the Tag Tree Thicket? The Tag Tree Thicket, if the CPU were to run at its same boost mode speeds, it'll handle this area very well. You're going to notice that as we're driving around, as we're looking around, we don't have any slowdown on the character or any issues. It's only once we start boosting and driving around and moving the camera a lot do we see decreased performance with the character's actual movement and how the game handles it. But if you were to overclock the GPU to the Tegra X1's full potential as well, you're going to notice that all those issues go away, or are significantly decreased to say the less. So now we're driving through the Tag Tree Thicket with a minimal amount of slowdown, issues, dropped frames, and it runs very, very well. Soon as we jump into the water, we have no issues with the game being able to load in Pokemon around us far away in the distance. We have no issues when boosting through the water. This is peak performance of the Nintendo Switch. Now, if you were to do this for an extended period of time, or if you were to even do like a half-hour sandwich for a hunt, you're going to notice that your fans are going to zoom up a whole lot. But on my OLED Switch, as soon as I stood next to that windmill, my fans were whirling up a storm in the first place. So that isn't really anything out of the ordinary. Now, the character models are still in their low poly versions until you actually get close to them, and then when you're in a battle, you get the high poly models of all the Pokemon around you, but that's how the game's supposed to run. Now, if you were to have a Nintendo Switch whose CPU was at its full potential, and if you were to have the GPU running to its full Tegra X1 speed, the speed of a chip produced 7 years ago for an Android tablet, and if you were to allow the game to run at 60 FPS, could it? It can. Pokemon move smoother, the world is smoother, you see fluttering of wings more accurately, and with everything that Pokemon Scarlet and Violet has done to try to make this game run better and run smoother, why are we getting such poor performance? Now, here's the funny part. Because the game's actual timer for things like meal powers and playtime is linked directly to your frame rate, if you were to cook a sandwich and then have the game run at 60 frames per second, it would actually be faster than real time. Unlike right now, because of how slow the game's actual performance is, typically if you make a half-hour sandwich for a hunt, it's lasting 32 to 35 minutes because of all the slowdown and lack of 30 FPS stability. Right now, I'm about 3 or 4 seconds ahead of real time after counting this for about a minute and a half. So it's clear that 60 frames per second was never an objective by the team. But in order to maintain and hold 30 frames per second, it should be able to be achieved, or at least with the full power of the chip that's already in the Nintendo Switch. And keep in mind, this is running on a custom firmware Nintendo Switch that is the original V1 Switch, not the Tegra X Plus chip that has better thermals and battery life. So here's my question. Do you think that the team over at Creatures and Game Freak Pokemon made this with the idea of optimizing it for the OLED Nintendo Switch, but then similar to situations that we saw for the Xbox Series S and X, because they're so vastly different performance of systems, did they have to scale everything back for the regular Tegra X1 chip? And because of the original X1's chip and Pokemon's idea to be as inclusive as possible, they wanted to make sure that the OLED Nintendo Switch and the Switch Lite users didn't have a better experience. And possibly this concept prevented them from implementing a better performance profile that would utilize more of the Nintendo Switch's overall power? Or is it possible that they were developing for a new Nintendo Switch, a more powerful Nintendo Switch, that because of whatever reason, chips shortages, problems since they started developing this game over 3 years ago, that Switch never was released and never came to fruition, despite multiple press leaks saying that a more powerful Switch was going to be made and released? The only reason I'm pointing toward this idea even more so has somewhat to do with Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom being delayed until next year. Was Tears of the Kingdom supposed to be the holiday 2022 release, but because this Switch wasn't ready, they didn't want to release the game with troubling performance, and Pokemon Scarlet and Violet was moved up to this time slot and forced to deal with this poorer performance? I guess we're gonna have to wait until May of next year, where Tears of the Kingdom comes out, and possibly in 2023 wait for a Nintendo Direct in January or March, or the investors briefing to hear about a new, more powerful Nintendo Switch revision, because March 3rd of next year, the Nintendo Switch is going to be in its 6th year, and the Tegra X1 chip is then going to be 8 years old. There's no reason that Nintendo, a very successful gaming company who makes amazing games, should be running on chips this old, unless all of this was in the way to keep costs down for ease of accessibility for everyone. Because that's the only thing I could see that could possibly make sense on why Pokemon Scarlet and Violet shouldn't be running at a beautiful performance all of the time. and possibly because of the limitations of the hardware and how they had to adapt the game to work on the worser systems, led them to take their time and resources away from developing better looking textures, more complex environments. Iono's Town of Lavencia may actually be the look into what Game Freak, Creatures Inc., and Pokemon had the idea for what was actually going to be capable for Pokemon Scarlet and Violet. This city has so many custom assets that are not used anywhere else that are frequently on display here. It has custom roads, custom buildings, custom billboards, lamps, tents, things that we haven't seen in any other town. If they had more time and more resources to put to making the game a better game overall, would they have been able to give every single city the love and attention that it deserves, like this city was? Or is it possible that the lack of optimization for this game falls solely on the simple fact that Pokemon always tries to make sure that their games coincide with the anime, the trading card game, merchandise, and everything else to keep their successful conveyor belt of consumer products available, alive, and well? The number one thing I look at Pokemon Scarlet and Violet meaning is that before the launch or on launch day of Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, we are going to be getting a new Nintendo Switch, a more powerful Nintendo Switch, capable of higher clock speeds and sustained performance. Well guys, I hope you found this information helpful. If you did, do me a favor, hit the thumbs up button down below. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments section. Thank you so much for being here. Until next time, Austin John out.
Man, they see me shining like I got the charm. Stay strapped, got that jet ball in my palm. Fell from the sky, guess I'm the chosen one. And if you need to know how, check out Austin John. Champion flow, flow, yeah. I got that champion flow, flow.